Again, I'd like to thank the organizers of this annual event for inviting me again to be given the opportunity to interact with students from all over the world. The theme of this workshop is quite appropriate because reshaping international society in the global order. Of course, we all know that the process has already begun. It is ongoing. The final form of this process of reshaping the world, we do not know how it will end. The point is to be a part of it. And I believe that opportunities like this, in which each and every one of the countries represented here have an opportunity to come together to learn from each other. For me personally, face-to-face interaction, dialoguing, debating, discoursing, disagreeing with one another, that is the process of reshaping the global world. The process is not entirely positive. It has its ups and downs. It has its promise. And I believe that each and every one of us can share in making it more fruitful for everyone in the world. Not only those who have long benefited from the world economy, but more so those who still have to benefit from this world economy. So, having said that, I'd like to talk about what I call the varieties of development, rethinking the role of state and market in the 21st century. I'd like to begin by throwing some questions regarding development. Of course, the concept of development is very important to each and every one of us here, particularly those who belong to the developing countries, the so-called third world, the developing economies, those who are left behind by the initial fruits of development in the world economy. What is development? For some, they ask the question, what conditions are particularly crucial for the kinds of changes that make people develop? So there are those who would like to look at the economic preconditions that will bring forth economic growth, that will bring forth prosperity and hence development. But the question is development simply a question of economic growth? Or is it something more than just higher GDPs or higher GNPs? If so, what explanations do theories offer for development, maldevelopment, or even underdevelopment? I have mentioned the third world. In this day and age, does the third world still exist? And how do theories take into consideration internal differentiation within individual societies? Is there a one-size-fits-all path to development? Is there a simple formula towards achieving higher growth rates and human development? What development strategies are suggested in the various theories? Now, these are just some questions that have been asked in what has emerged as a sub-discipline in the social science called development studies or international development. I do not intend to answer all of these questions, but rather I am just raising them for us to be reminded of the complexities of the development question. What is development? If you look at the literature, there are as many definitions of development. Of course, you know, the task of the academic, they say, is to simplify complicated questions. But more often than not, academics end up complicating simple questions. So, but then again, that's the task of academics. One of the foremost writer on economic development, Todaro, defined development as a multi-dimensional process involving major changes in social structures, popular attitudes, and national institutions, as well as the acceleration of economic growth, the reduction of inequality, and the eradication of poverty. Another author, the late Martin Nussen, development economist who passed away recently, said the societal reproduction and transformation processes of the developing countries in conjunction with the international factors that influence these processes. And lastly, a more recent definition was given by Ole Turnquist, who studied development in developing societies and countries, particularly in Southeast Asia. He defined development as the process in which resources are put to better use, whatever that better use means, in a country, region, or a sector of society, like industry or growth. As you can see, this is just a sampling of the various definitions of development. But of course, there are several perspectives, there are several focus to this definition. The first one would look at the economic aspect, while the others would look at other variables that might help explain development. The development project is not new. I think it's better for me to stand there. Okay. The development project is not new. In fact, it began in Europe. Okay. During the time when Europe transitioned from the feudal era to the so-called age of modernity. And of course, the trigger for the first wave of development in the West was the so-called Age of Enlightenment, followed by the political and social turmoil that were triggered by the French Revolution, and later on, the technological innovation that was brought about by the Industrial Revolution in Europe. So the entire concept of progress and modernity, since it began in the West, and given the colonial adventure of the West, the Western colonizers aimed to transplant their own development experience in their colony. Of course, with a twist. Why? Because as we all know, from those countries who had a sad experience of colonial rule, colonialism bred inequality and underdevelopment within the former colonies. Colonialism brought about unequal economic relations, and it became the template for modernity, which is simply to follow the same development formula, the same development path of the West. But we all know that in most countries, former colonies, in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, the people of these continents rose up and struggled to break this unequal ties and fight for their independence. In some instances, this came in the form of nationalist bourgeois revolutions, just like in the Philippines, or in some instances, it came in the successful revolution led by communist movements, just like here in China or in Vietnam. But what was the practice after the Second World War? After the Second World War, after 1945, emerged what is to be known as the Washington Consensus, also known as the Keynesian Consensus in the West. Okay. And this resulted in the birth of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And and later on GATT, which is the precursor of the World Trade Organization. The period after 1945 also saw many of the developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia trying to catch up with the development of the West. This period was marked also by ideological struggle at the height of the Cold War, which ended with the collapse of the former Soviet Union. The collapse of the former Soviet Union is said to be the beginning of a new wave of transformation in the world known as globalization. But of course, of recent time period, we have seen that globalization and its promise of free trade is not the end all and be all. As we have seen in Asia in 1997, the height of the Asian financial crisis, and as we have seen 2 years ago with the global financial crisis. So we are now at that point in which we have to rethink what truly works for underdeveloped or developing societies or economies. Throughout time, there have been several schools of thought or perspectives on development. From the 1960s onwards, several theories or perspectives have emerged in an attempt to answer the development question. One of the more popular during the 1960s and have been taught to some of us during our younger years in the university is the so-called modernization or political development theory, popularized by Walt Rostow in his Stages of Economic Growth, a non-communist manifesto, in which Rostow tried to echo the tenets of Karl Marx, but the flip side, the opposite side of Karl Marx, in which, in the same manner that dialectics was applied by Marx to point historical materialism and the different stages of development, ending towards socialism and communism, Walt Rostow also gave his stages of growth, but this time the end point is capitalism or development in the capitalist mode. And in Walt Rostow's theory of modernization, all pre-modern society starts at the traditional hunter-gatherer stage, just like in Marx. But there comes a point in which there is a precondition for takeoff, and then there's that takeoff, and then there's that point of maturity, and then, of course, capitalist heaven. So that was how Rostow, and this was, of course, embraced by many scholars and economists in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, and the world. Until the 1970s and 1980s, when this stages of growth formula was found wanting, and was not, a lot of countries in Africa and Latin America and even in Southeast Asia were not taking off. And this resulted in a critique, in a critique of the modernization stages theory, which eventually we call dependency theory. And the dependency theory emerged from Latin America, questioning the entire premise of the modernization theory. And then, of course, yesterday and the previous day we had the thesis defense, and some of you presented this. The dependency theory is premised primarily on, actually the main root of the dependency idea is taken from Lenin's theory of imperialism, in which a country that is integrated in the world capitalist system, you have a dominant economy and the rest are satellites or peripheral economies. and the relationship is usually unequal. The relationship is that of dependence. Of course, through time, the dependency theory itself lost some grounds. Why? Because of East Asia. Okay? Because of the so-called developmental state. Okay? But before that, there were another trend happening in the world. During the late 70s and the early 80s, the welfare state of the West, particularly in Europe and in the United States, were facing a crisis, okay, of what they call the overdeveloped state. Okay? And this gave impetus to the rise of neoliberalism, which, of course, can be summarized by the famous quote from Ronald Reagan, the prophet of neoliberalism, together with the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher. According to Reagan, government is not the solution to our problem, but rather government is the problem. So for Reagan and the neoliberals, what was the solution? What was the solution to the problems of society? Markets. Okay? Leave everything to the market forces. Okay? So that was the solution. And from the national to the international, this was the mantra of the neoliberals. Privatize, liberalize, free trade, leave everything to the market. At around the same time, there was an opposing framework that was building up in East Asia. And this was the so-called developmental state model. While the former welfare states of the West were trying to overhaul its entire political economic system by privatizing, liberalizing, removing state intervention in the economy, in the East, particularly in Northeast Asia, we saw a different phenomenon in which the state took charge and played an important role in attaining economic growth and industrialization. The developmental state refers to, and I'm not referring here to state as in sovereign states. No? State here is, I should clarify this. So state here refers to the political administrative structure. And the developmental state, as you will see, is composed of two honest-to-goodness nation-states, independent countries, one non-state, and two city-states. Okay? So it refers to middle-income countries that pursue export-oriented growth strategies propelled by high levels of investment in both physical and human capital. Okay? The template for this growth strategy was Northeast Asia, namely Japan. Japan was first here, followed by South Korea, later on by Taiwan. Okay? The non-state, I would like to emphasize. Okay. And then emulated by the so-called newly industrializing countries in the late 80s and the early 90s, the so-called NICs, NIC, also known as the tiger economies. The Northeast Asian developmental states were called the dragon economies, and those in the Southeast Asia NICs were called the tiger economies, namely of Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. Generally, they pursue the neo-mercantilist and nationalist development trajectory that combines strong state intervention with the promotion of big economic conglomerates. I will explain this later in detail. This concept of developmental state was actually coined by a social scientist who was studying the success of the Japanese developmental state. and this was Chalmers Johnson. Chalmers Johnson studied the role of one important bureaucratic office in Japan that helped propel its success. This was the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. MITI. What was the entire rationale behind the developmental state? According to Chalmers Johnson, unlike the Marxist concept of the capitalist state, which is a tool for exploiting the working class, he follows a different model. That is the Weberian, as in the German Max Weber, sociologist, Weberian concept of a rational, legal planning state. Okay? A rational legal state is an efficient state that plans. Okay? The difference is that the developmental state is a rational legal state that plans within a capitalist economy. Okay? Unlike the former Soviet model, which was ideological planning, but not within a market system, or the liberal capitalist system of the United States, in which there is no planning at all, and everything is left to the forces of market. So that makes the developmental state different from the rest. Okay? So here you have the combination of the Weberian rational legal bureaucratic state plus Confucian values. Some would accept this, others would deny the role of culture. But if you will look at the literature, practically half of the literature on the East Asian model would say culture played a role, the Confucian Asian values, which is subject to debate because, just like what we always say, Asia is not a country. Asia is diverse. It has different cultural traditions. Okay? Now, in fact, there was a difference between the first tier and the second tier of East Asian economies. The first, in the Northeast Asia, the so-called dragon economies, particularly in Japan and South Korea, they relied more on what is known as import substitution industrialization, a form of nationalist protectionism. The point is to keep prices low in the international arena, the international market, but keeping it high in the local market. Okay? And then instead of importing in order to save your resources, you substitute it with resources that you can find within your country, even at a higher price. Okay? And then this entailed a large participation of public investment, the government. Okay? Another template was that in Japan and South Korea, and even Taiwan, where did they get the capital to invest publicly? If they needed to source it from within their country, the only way to make it is to create it. And how do you create wealth within your country? The first thing that was implemented, although in Japan it was indirect, was agrarian reform or land reform. They distributed land so that all those resources, all those capital were unleashed to the former rural farmers, and eventually they prospered and became domestic capitals. So that was the Northeast Asian developmental state. In the Southeast Asian model, it was different. Because there are some Southeast Asian countries that lack resources, captured by the elite, controlled by big landholding families. You have corruption, you have clientelism, you have all these other problems. Okay? So instead of following the same model, they opened up their economy. and they opened up their economy to foreign direct investment. Okay. So they embrace globalization and free trade. Okay. Like Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. Okay. Now, I don't know if you can see this, no, but we'll reproduce this later and I will display it. The main difference in Southeast Asia is they had to look for their own domestic sources of capital also. Aside from opening up their economies to foreign direct investment. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia benefited from two things. First was during the 1980s when in the trade talks between the United States and Japan, the so-called Plaza Accords held in Tokyo, the United States forced Japan to devalue the yen. Okay? And because of this, the Japanese had to look for other countries to put in their money so that they can invest in cheap labor and manufacturing. And the first countries in Southeast Asia that benefited from this foreign direct investment were Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. And it's a sad story for the Philippines because we've missed out on that opportunity. Okay. Then, another big factor, if you will see, is that most of the Southeast Asian states also opened up its economy to Chinese capital. Okay. There's a big chunk of foreign direct investment from China. Plus, another important aspect in Southeast Asia, in most of these countries, there are a large or a significant portion of the population who are ethnic Chinese, who have been assimilated to their society and culture. How much time do I have?
Maybe 3 minutes?
3 minutes, okay. See, it's so difficult to talk about development with all of these details. Anyways, okay. Now, the developmental state model suffered in recent times because of what happened to Japan during the 1990s when the economic bubble burst in Japan and paved the way for almost 2 decades of recession. Okay? Japan calls the 90s the lost decade and might as well call this decade another lost decade. And really, Japan is at the bottom right now with all these problems, particularly with the earthquake and all these things, the political problems. In the end, the developmental state model was found wanting because of the too close collaboration between the state and the market. Because, you know, under the developmental state model, the state selects champions in different sectors of the economy. These are big business conglomerates. They compete among themselves, and then whoever wins in this internal competition, the state will support 100% in its fight in the international market. So in Japan, you have the Saibatsus. In Korea, you have the Chaibols. Do I pronounce it correctly? Chaibols. Okay. And then, but of course, with all this financial crisis, first the 1997 financial crisis, and then the 2009 global financial crisis, the problem that emerged was too close coordination between state and market results in what? Collusion, corruption, okay? Moral hazards. Okay. So, South Korea was hit by the 1997 financial crisis. How about the Southeast Asian countries that did not pursue strong state intervention that much but opened its doors to foreign investment? It suffered also. Why? Because it was a global virus. It was an economic virus. And just like any virus, you know, a virus does not choose whom to contaminate, right? So everybody was affected. Okay, so how do we look at this problem right now? There's a new way of looking at capitalism. And of course, it's still subject to much debate, but I invite you to join in this debate, to know about this debate, and even to say something about the debate. This new concept is known as the Varieties of Capitalism, which is an institutional approach to international political economy, and was first elaborated by Peter Hall and David Soskis. And there's a lot of materials out there, and there's a lot of variation on the varieties of capitalism, but the simple version is that there are two types of economies that have emerged in recent times: the liberal market economy and the coordinated market economy. It is no longer a question whether we will participate in the market or not, right? I think we have more or less solved that problem. I mean, we have addressed that issue. Even in Africa, I know things are changing, even in Latin America. The market, per se, is not evil. It's people who play in the market. It's like any other material aspects. No? So, you have the liberal market economy, which emphasizes competitive market arrangements, and some countries have embraced it, like India, and have succeeded. And there are those who are still following the non-market relationships, more coordination between state and market, like China. Okay. So here, you have Greenspan saying, "My sense is that one consequence of this Asian crisis is an increasing awareness in the region that market capitalism as practiced in the West, especially in the United States, is the superior model. That is, it provides greater promise of producing rising standards of living and continuous growth." Of course, the global financial crisis proved him wrong. What we can say is perhaps the US model is just one of the models that can be adopted, but it's not the superior model, right? So, the reality is that the reality in economics is that there is always a possibility of market failure. Okay? So, over-reliance of the market is not the smart way of doing it. At the same time, over-reliance on the state is also not the smart way of doing it, right? Because governments are also subject to government failure, particularly, from our own collective experience in this room, right? We have experienced corruption and all of these negative aspects of reliance on government. But then again, the market has its promise. There is the fruits of capitalism that can be had by everyone if it is properly implemented. There's innovation, efficiency, prosperity. Is government the problem? Not really. If there's one thing that China has shown us, and this is the great helmsman, Deng Xiaoping, who introduced market reforms in China. Black cat or white cat, it doesn't matter as long as it catches mice. Okay? So I think the lesson to be learned here is not to be dogmatic, not to be doctrinaire, not even to be ideological. For the benefit of the poor people in our respective countries and our region, we should be practical. In the end, we should be smart. So what's my point? The point is, well, I was supposed to talk about China, but I'm running out of time. It's a tripod. tripod will only stand if there's balance. In state, market, most important of all, people. And people matters in the end. Thank you very much.